I just got word that we have coming in for our museum, we have some survivors, the mother of one of the big survivors of the Boko Haram nightmare with Muslims coming in and just taking these kids, and Michelle Obama tweeting, we want our girls back. Well, we got some of them, and we have one of the mothers coming in from Nigeria to talk about that. We have a couple of people that are going to be docents at this museum because it's not our usual museum.
That's right. Yeah, this museum...
Can you explain a little bit? Go ahead.
This really, how do we say this? There's so much we learn about history that is history, but history really is today. We will look at the African slave trade, 350 years, 12.7 million Africans brought out of Africa into slavery in 350 years, okay? But today, there are 40 million in slavery today. That's more than 350 years of the African slave trade. What are we doing about it today? And so when you can't really denigrate
our founding fathers and say, oh, they didn't do enough, when the problem is much worse and we're not even looking at it.
That's right.
David, we're going to clear up some things, and I think we're going to make a few people mad with some of the stats, but they are official stats. For instance, the two that we keep coming back to, one, the slave trade in America was horrible.
That's
horrible.
Right. That's right.
But out of all those that were enslaved and brought across the ocean, we were only 4% of the receivers.
Yeah,
the number one was Brazil.
Brazil was 46% of all those carried out of Africa went to Brazil. 26% went to Great Britain. 10% went to Jamaica. You keep going down the list. We're one of the smallest on the list, which doesn't excuse what we had. But America, the English colonies in America, 3.3%. Denmark had less than that. So, but we're at the bottom, and that's still way too many. Shouldn't have happened. There's no excuse. But what we also point out is there has never been any people in history that, number one, did not own slaves, and number two, were not themselves slaves at some time. And so the American academic thing of slavery is absolutely white on black, and it's white privilege, and et cetera. Statistically, that doesn't hold up. Quite frankly, you had, in that same period, Muslims captured 1.25 million slaves, and most of them Christian slaves. They were doing religious slavery. We know that at the time of the Civil War in South Carolina, 43% of free blacks in South Carolina owned black slaves. And we know that with the Indian tribes at the time of the Civil War, 1 out of every 8 among the 5 major Indian tribes, they were black slaves. Indians were big owners of slaves. As a matter of fact, when the 13th Amendment was passed, it didn't apply to the Indian nation. And so the Indian nations had slavery much longer than we had it in the 13th Amendment.
And you never hear any of this. You never hear any of it. And again, we'll only get in trouble for those who think we're trying to excuse it. And we're not. We're not. Just trying to give perspective and to show you that history repeats itself. And without a true balanced look at history, you can't do anything. You're just going to be trapped in the past. History is being made right now, today. David, how did it end in Brazil? How come somebody who takes 46%, we only take 4%? Do they struggle with their slave heritage?
Oh, no, they don't cover that in history, but Brazil still is a very high country for a high number of slaves today. One of the things that we have as you come into the museum is a map showing the dispersion of slaves at 12.7 million to all the nations back then. Kind of shows a hot spot, which were the hot nations. Well, there's a map today for the 40 million, and you look at the hot spots, and Brazil is still a hot spot. So it's not like that they have gotten over this. This is still a very current thing all across Africa. They're the same places that were culprits 300 years ago are still culprits today, quite frankly.
It's also interesting, and this is just this. You don't even leave the lobby or the first part of the. I think we have it broken up in 9 sections. We're only covering the stuff that's in section 1.
Yeah, that's
You'll
right.
be in there for like 10 minutes. I mean, this is section 1. The fact that we fought a civil war. We had the 13th Amendment, which will be down in our studios. You'll be able to see the actual document, and I think the Juneteenth document as well, isn't it?
Yeah, Juneteenth, when the announcement reached Texas, which was like a year and a half later that the 13th Amendment was signed, so it was the Emancipation Proclamation. But we actually have the pen that Lincoln used to sign the 13th Amendment right there with the 13th Amendment. So it's really some amazing stuff.
It's really going to be cool.
Once-in-a-lifetime kind of opportunity to see some cool stuff.
Yeah. And we, as we're doing this, we look at, again, our founders and we say, they were horrible. Well, Mexico actually abolished slavery before we did. Do you know the dates, David?
I don't remember the dates. Technically, on paper, they abolished slavery. It didn't really work out that way because they had a 99-year kind of exception. Oh, by the way, if you own slaves, you can hold them up to 99 more years. But we're abolishing slavery, but you get to keep your slaves for 99 years.
And isn't that pretty much what we get yelled at for with our founders when they made the compromise in the Constitution and said, look, we're going to phase out this part and we'll come back to it later. I mean, at least they didn't say, and 100 years later, then it's going to stop. Well, they were hoping that it would stop earlier.
Their abolition of the slave trade, that they said in 1787, we want this ended by 1808. That's the earliest of any nation. I mean, abolishing slave trade, 1808. We're first on that. We're kind of second in actually abolishing slavery. We are the only nation in the history of the world where the whites fought whites and ended slavery for blacks. I mean, we've got so many firsts that don't get talked about. But what happened even with the founding fathers and the slave trade, the problem we have with academics today is that there is a northern view of slavery where that, for example, in Massachusetts, there never was a time when blacks could not vote. You have a middle view of slavery in the middle colonies, and you have a southern view, which is where the plantation slavery was, all the abominations. And all we cover is the southern view of slavery. We don't cover the middle colony view or the northern colony view. And so we really do not teach an accurate view of history on what happened with race. And, we're going to hope to do that in the museum. Not hope to, we're doing that in the museum because we want truth. Truth is the objective we have.